This story, called Margaret, is dedicated to the many Margarets who contributed unknowingly to it. Hello, this is James from All Saints. I called earlier. Yes, come on up. I'm opening the door for you. It's apartment 803. The voice was distorted over the apartment intercom and I had no sense from it about its owner. The door clicked open and I found the elevator straight ahead. The inside was hung with brown covers. It must have been someone's moving day. As I stepped out at the 8th floor, I wondered what I would find. A bent-over little old lady with a walker, perhaps. In fact, the door to apartment 803 opened as I arrived. The lady was certainly elderly, mid-80s, I guessed, but quite tall, with an erect carriage and no walker. She greeted me warmly and with a firm voice. "It's so nice of you to come. Come on in." The apartment was comfortably furnished, nothing fancy, and the window had a nice view beyond the town to Lake Ontario. Tables on the mantel shelf over the fake log fire had numerous photos of younger people, grandchildren I assumed. One photograph by itself depicted a tall couple who appeared to be in their 60s at a formal event, probably a dance. I assumed that this must be Margaret and her late husband. After the formalities of where I should sit, I suggested that she might tell me something about herself or her life. "No, I don't usually look back on the past," she replied. "So tell me something," I said, recognizing an English accent. "How long have you lived in Canada?" "Oh, I came over in 1945, she said. "A war bride?" "Yes, I was one of the lucky ones. My first husband and I came over together at the end of the war." I realized why she had said lucky. I'd heard stories of other war brides who'd been left behind in England when their new husbands returned to Canada. They'd been forced to wait for a year or more and then travel on a special sailing for war brides, often now with a young child in tow. I'd always admired these women for their courage, setting out for a new and unknown country on their own, arriving at Pier 21 in Halifax, being processed through immigration, then facing a 2-day journey to Toronto by train. I recalled one lady in particular. Her husband had been unable to meet her in Toronto. It was winter, because of the weather. Then on the basis of a telegram to the CNR station master in Toronto, she'd had to find her way into snowy rural southern Ontario to meet up with her husband in Fergus all alone. "So how did you and your husband meet?" I asked, to keep the conversation going. "Was he RCAF?" "Yes, and I was in the RAF. I joined up in 1941, right after leaving school. By the time we met, I was working in the control tower, guiding bombers back after their raids. We used radar to look for the bombers as they came home. We called it RDF in those days, radio direction finding, so that the enemy wouldn't know that we could track range as well as direction." "You know, that's really amazing when you think about it," I said. "You must have still been a teenager. These days we never think of people that young being able to take on such responsible positions." She smiled. "You do what you have to," she said. "That's just the way it was." "So, was your husband a bomber pilot?" In what seemed like a millisecond, a kaleidoscope of memories flashed through Margaret's mind. Images that she'd not thought of or shared in decades. She remembered breaking radio silence with stricken aircraft on their way home, piloted by young men her own age, whose youthful bravado was threatening to disintegrate as they endeavoured to bring home their similarly disintegrating aircraft. She remembered suddenly the anguish of that very first time when one of those blips disappeared from her cathode ray screen and the pilot's voice ceased, only 20 miles from home. It happened many times, she recalled, but none had the immediacy of that first occasion. The pilot's name suddenly came back to her, Jimmy. She'd been too distraught to complete her shift. Then there was the misery of the old hall, belonging to Lord someone or other. She forgot who that had been. They had been requisitioned by the War Office. It was where she and all the other girls had been housed, how desperately cold it was in the winter. A room heated, sometimes, by a 1-bar electric fire, with blankets from home piled above her on the bed. She remembered sleeping with an old frayed sweater on top of her nightdress, trying to keep the cold out. On dark winter evenings, the bus that arrived to take them for their long shifts, 7 until 7, was almost invisible in the blackout. With no lights visible, even when they were on the road, their way was lit only by headlights that pointed down, partly shaded by a metal grille. Yes, we met during 1944. He was halfway through his tour at the time and he'd already completed 10 sorties. Another millisecond, another flashback. Jack, tall and gangly, just off the farm with sandy hair, what you'd call an open face. He was so shy out of his airplane and his uniform, it was transparently plain that he'd had to screw up all his courage to ask her to the mess dance that first time. She really hadn't noticed him before. Images surfaced in her mind of walks together on the South Downs, the very first time she'd given herself to him, on a picnic at the end of some woods on a summer June day. The trees bright with early summer foliage, the hedgerows buzzing with insects, and birds wheeling in the air, oblivious to the horror of war around them. And then a darker image, her terror every time that Jack was out on a sortie, each time mentally calculating the odds, whether he would survive to the end of his tour, and more immediately, would he return early the next morning, or would his blip disappear from her radar screen right before her eyes, or maybe never appear on it. So what did you do once you came to Canada? Margaret slipped back to the present while simultaneously recalling the past. Jack thought he might go back to the farm, but his dad was still running it. It didn't work out. After a bit he got a job at a supercess station in Hamilton and apprenticed as a mechanic. Must have been in the 1950s, around 1954, when one afternoon he'd been off at lunch. Work was very slow that day and the owner of the station said to put his own car up on the hoist to make it look like they had work. When Jack came back from lunch, somehow the hoist was defective, knocked him to the floor as it came down, and the car crushed him. He survived the war, but he didn't survive that, said Margaret. Didn't know what I could possibly say that wasn't utterly banal, so I kept quiet. Anyway, she went on, a few years later I met Arthur. She pointed to the picture of the couple at the dance. That's him and me on our 25th wedding anniversary. He loved to dance. He was how I got involved with All Saints. Arthur was a member of the congregation all his life. He was very active, warden, sidesman, you name it. He was the one who organised the fundraiser for the little rose window over the church door. I don't get to church very much now, she added. Must get lonely for you all by yourself in the apartment, I said. I noticed you didn't come out to the seniors' tea last week. No, they called me to ask if I'd like to go. They even said they'd pick me up, but it's too much for me in this humid weather with my asthma. Actually, I don't mind living alone, she said. I like to read and my daughter comes by most days after she finishes work, and she takes me shopping in her car every week. So it's not like I'm all alone. I had to give up my car. I didn't feel safe on the roads anymore. I don't think I'd fit in at one of those retirement places. Oh, you mean you're not the bingo and Tai Chi type? Not likely. I'm afraid that just isn't my style. I'm so glad I can stay in my own apartment. This is where I hope to live out my life. Yes, I said. Seems to me that the news media have given us the idea that everyone will end up in a retirement home or a nursing home. But the reality is that most people are lucky enough to be able to live out their lives in their own homes. Do keep talking, I went on, but if it's all right with you, I'll just start setting up the communion set on this little table. You'll see that I use these little paper tissues as purificators. I always say to my wife that ironing linens isn't part of my theology. I burn them when I get home. I have to tell you one funny story. One day when I set fire to some tissues outside the back door, fell right on the cat. She didn't half move quickly. Margaret laughed. That's fine. I'd like to take communion together. Thank you so much for coming. It's genuinely a pleasure. I really mean that. You get to know people so much better when you meet them at home than when you just shake their hands and say hello after church on Sunday. You remember I said I hardly ever talk about things from so long ago? I guess it's because we have something in common, you know, you with your English accent. Then she added wistfully, you know, my time back in the war, working on the control tower was very exciting. I think it might have been the best time of my life.